think we will begin, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're very excited about this session, particularly because we've had an initial conversation on the responsible data guides at Local Evaluation 2020. And today we're coming full circle with this conversation. And when we started, it was really just us figuring out how to conduct digital mail during COVID-19, when COVID-19 hit us in 2020. And when we had that conversation at Local Evaluation Week 2020, there was just so much interest around, remote monitoring and administrative data and how to be responsible with our data during our day-to-day activity. And I think what was even more exciting about what was coming forward, not necessarily from the panel, but from the audience like yourself who joined us on the day, it was the need for a tangible product that they can look at, that they can refer to, in terms of the challenges that they're going through in terms of how they tackle data. And we set out a call to say, okay, if you want to be part of this project, let us know, let's link up and let's see how we can together work on this project. And we've done just that. So today I have three of our panelists. We've been working together on this project on the responsible data in monitoring and evaluation in the African context. And there are three others who couldn't join us today, but I will introduce to you the three that are here. So we do have like I mentioned, the guides. We just published them late last year, in December last year, and there are two guides. One is really an overview of data governance in the African context, while the other is delving more into more of a practical ways or how to around managing your data. So I'm going to ask rather one of my colleagues to share the guides in the chat if you do not have them, and then we will go ahead and begin our conversation. So the session is really to present to you our findings, but also to share with you some of the trends that are coming up as far as responsible data governance. So let me introduce first my colleague, Mark Irura, who's a technical advisor at GIZ Fair Forward. Mark has extensive experience heading end-to-end digital implementation for bilateral and multilateral development agencies, government ministries and private foundations, with more than a decade of experience, predominantly in the East and Southern Africa. Mark has implemented and managed large-scale M&E platforms, assessed scalable technical tools, and designed comprehensive data models and enterprise software tools to visualize and manage data. So he has also undertaken work in understanding the open contracting and open data landscape in West and East Africa. As a practitioner, he therefore possesses first-hand experience on data security and data privacy demands and concerns when data has to be collected and processed across various sectors. We also have on the panel with us Desiree Jason, who is a senior manager in the Southern African National Government at the National Department of Social Development, who's responsible for monitoring and evaluation of policies and programs. Des has over the years acquired skills in senior management, policy development, strategic planning, program management, and so forth. She is extremely passionate to work on initiatives aimed at improving lives of our most marginalized and vulnerable members of society. Then we have, last but not least, Jerusha Govender, who is the Director for Digital Data Solutions at Data Innovators. Jerusha is an entrepreneur, data creative, and monitoring and evaluation specialist. She has worked extensively in promoting the use of information for decision-making and experimental sharing in the public sector in Africa and across the globe. Jerusha is passionate about telling stories with data and teaching others to do so. So Jerusha is a board member also at the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Associate. So those are our panel for today. So we're going to be having a conversation. We're going to be engaging more on this work that we've put together, and we invite you to join in the conversation. We don't want to have the conversation amongst ourselves, so we would really like for you to participate. We have a Q&A at the end of the session, so as we go along, you can just be busy typing in your questions. And yeah, any contribution is really much welcome. So let's get right into it, colleagues. I'm going to start with Mark. Mark, if you can maybe give us, we have an overview of the data governance guide. That's the first report that we wrote. Maybe you can give us an overview on what's coming out with data governance in terms of local and on a local and global level.
Sorry, Talita, Mark just messaged me that his laptop died and he's going to restart and he'll be back in a minute.
Okay, that's no problem. I'm wondering then if we can, I will just skip to Jerusha if you don't mind, and then we'll go back to the question. Just keep that in mind. We just wanted to get an overview of what's coming out in data governance. But then maybe let me ask Jerusha, if you don't mind, Jerusha, are you comfortable with me asking the second question? I was going to ask you what the practicalities, what does this mean practically, considering data governance throughout the MEL cycle? So we use the MEL cycle and the data life cycle in our framework when we produce the overview of the data governance. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Sure, thanks. I'll speak to that. I do have one slide. Is it Linda that will be sharing, or should I share my screen? Okay, thanks. So yeah, no problem. I think a lot of this Mark's kind of overview on data governance will provide a bit more context. But I just want to speak to the more kind of practical considerations of, where do we practically see data governance, and what does that mean for an M&E practitioner that needs to be thinking about this and actually implementing data governance practices. And so what you're seeing now is two cycles. So on the left-hand side, it's an M&E cycle, or a version of an M&E cycle that you may have seen at some point in your M&E or related career. And we know that within this M&E cycle that you're seeing on the left-hand side, there's data collection and analysis that happens at each of these stages, starting from at the point of your design of your evaluation or your M&E kind of system planning, within your baseline design and implementing, and all the way through to diagnosis and consultation. Every point there is a requirement for some form of data collection, analysis, or use. And because of this is why data governance is also critical to the M&E field and to M&E practitioners. And similarly, on the right, you'll see we've got our data lifecycle. So both of these are the frames of reference that are used within the responsible data governance and M&E guidelines. And the key thing about the data lifecycle is that you could somewhat superimpose this data lifecycle over the M&E cycle, because it really tells us what is the journey of data if we travel kind of along the path from planning to collection to analyzing and actually communicating it. And this then really pulls out actually at each of these points, if we had to superimpose it over M&E, what are some of our data governance considerations that we do need to make, and we actually need to put in practice within our own M&E kind of implementation. And within the guide, we share at each of these 7 stages around the data lifecycle, there are specific data, responsible data governance kind of activities or guides that you can use. And just as an example to kind of draw this, take this home, is that if we think about just at the point of design and plan your data initiative, which is that kind of orangey section on the top of the data lifecycle. At this point alone, there are several considerations that we need to make from a data governance perspective. For example, at this point, we're thinking about what type of data do we need to collect? What is the format of the data? What is the source of the data? How will we be storing the data before we actually start implementing it? And just one action, which is also quite key, is that at this point, you would already then be thinking about what are some of the laws that are going to govern how I collect data, and what is the lawful kind of basis of my data collection. And we know that in Africa, according specifically to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, that there's about 28 African countries that have already got specific data privacy legislation, and 9 have some draft legislation. For example, South Africa's Protection of Personal Information Act, Nigeria has the Data Protection Bill, and Kenya has a Data Protection Act. And there are various others as well. Each of them are somewhat nuanced. So in your M&E planning, and as part of your design and plan your data initiative, one needs to consider what is my context, what are some of the laws that are going to influence how I plan, and then actually use that to then guide what are you going to be setting up in terms of your data collection tools, the security of the data, how long it's stored, and so on. And that's just one of the kind of considerations. Within the document, we do share what are the other practical considerations across these 7 stages, and it includes some guidelines on what that actually means in practice, what are some tip sheets, what are deep dives, which give us actual cases to kind of understand what it means in real life, as well as tools that are included in checklists to support the use of the guidelines throughout those stages. So there we go. Thanks, Talita.
Thanks, Jerusha. And I just wanted to highlight that what Jerusha was talking about in terms of the tip sheets and all of that, if you need to get more information on that, that's in our part 2 of the report. That's where all that data is from. But that's basically the framework that we use for the work. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna go back to Mark. Mark, we were just asking you before you dropped, just to shed some light on what's coming out in terms of the overview of data governance in Africa. So we're just going to take it a step back.
Yes, so as the slide deck is shared, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the need for accurate and timely and sufficiently disaggregated data has come into high demand, especially after 2015, after after adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. But it has also has come into conflict around with the needs for data privacy, data protection. So there is data that can drive development, but there's also data that can also drive the conversation around privacy, and how do we still not exacerbate inequality? How do we take care of that whilst we drive the development agenda? So you can see on the screen shared on the left, literature that has kind of tried to define the national statistical systems differently. And you can see under statistical producers, we have official statistics and unofficial statistics. And this basically tells us official statistics will be drawn from government sources predominantly. And then unofficial statistics would predominantly be drawn out of non-state actors such as civil society, chambers of commerce, and other private sector actors who kind of have data and are using data. And then we have statistical users, we have data suppliers, we have statistical training institutions, and we have professional statistical associations. And all these form the national statistical system. So it would not be the typical National Statistical Office only, which is synonymous with the statistical system. So park that, and then let's look at the figure on the right, where we look at the power relations. So government bodies, if we think of this as an iceberg, government bodies would typically be at the top. Then we have NGOs and international NGOs. We have policymakers. They sit at the kind of at the top of the data chain in terms of power. And you can find that at the very bottom, we have the data subjects and communities and individuals. And a lot of times they have no say about how their data is used, how it is collected, and where it is stored, and if they have a say on whether it's stored or not. So I'll come back to this question with this background. So number one, data sources do not just comprise official statistics. They are now alternative data sources. We have big data coming from Earth observations, telcos, or even citizen-generated data, and even social media that has come up. We also have Internet of Things. We have wearable devices. We have new sources of data and sensors, which give us a lot of data, which is very important. So having looked at the components of a national statistical system, that is one, in terms of how do we drive policy using data. But secondly, also having looked at power relations, then we can see that even though the digital data ecosystems have kind of really expanded, the literature tells us that, and our research has shown us that there's need to look at accountability and transparency again, and what informed consent means, because some of these things collect our data without our knowledge, but then we still have we should still have a legal, besides a moral and a ethical standard to uphold when it comes to data governance, especially to safeguard those who are at the bottom of the iceberg, like the communities and the individuals when you are looking at that diagram. Thanks. Back to you.
Thanks, Mark. I like your diagram on the power relations. Then I see like government bodies right at the top, and I'm just wondering if there's, from a government context, if you can give us what are some of the experiences in terms of, you know, implementing practical responsible data practices in government.
Okay, thanks, and once again, good afternoon to everyone. I think I can ask Linda to share the presentation. It's one slide. Thanks. But I think while she is loading, I'll start speaking then. So governments utilize empirical evidence to improve policies and programs. And governments, when we were struck by the pandemic, most governments became aware of the importance of data to improve services. The South African government, they developed a legislation titled Protection of Personal Information Act, and the acronym is normally known as POPI. I think Linda is the previous one, is the previous slide. Thanks. And the purpose of this act is to ensure data privacy and data protection laws, and which is mandated in the office of the information regulator that is seated in the Department of Justice. So the purpose of this act is to protect personal information of citizens throughout the data life cycle, and how data is collected, processed, stored, and how data is shared. It also touches on what Jerisa spoke about earlier on. So during the pandemic, we rolled out a grant which was titled the Special 350 COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant, which was targeting persons between the ages of 19 to 59 to ensure that vulnerable communities, they do have some sort of economic income into their households. This was the first and the largest scale online digital social security measure that the country had implemented. So we wanted to do an empirical study to see how we could improve the reach and the adequacy of this grant. For the very first time, we were then asked to apply for consent to the Information Regulator of South Africa to utilize the cell phone numbers or data of beneficiaries. And we were given very clear instructions to say that we could only use their personal information, like their names and surnames and ID numbers and their addresses, in order to protect their personal information. So we signed a data processing agreement with the service provider who was conducting the study, that the data will only be used for the purposes of the study and the data will be deleted or destroyed on the completion of the study. We then also needed to adapt some of our standard operating procedures to ensure effective data governance related to the data privacy and the data protection during the evaluation study. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Des. So, Mark, I'm listening to Des and I'm wondering what does responsible data and monitoring and evaluation fit in all of this? I mean, we know that, many practitioners are not necessarily data experts, or, they're not really aware of the regulations around them. How does this contribute to the M&E debate?
So thanks for that question. So we go back to two concepts that we have known, and we demand, like broadly, and this is accountability and transparency, but such has not been requested of, when we were looking at the iceberg, we were looking at the power dynamics within the data ecosystem and the different components. So we have to challenge the power dynamics there, and there's a need to deal with these issues. And when we talk about transparency, and when we talk about data protection, like when we make it practical, from our paper, we are saying that they are not in conflict, but rather we should look at how to be open, to make the methodology and intent of data use apparent to data subjects. How long will we collect this data, and how much data are we collecting? Can we also feed back what we have learned to these communities, because it is their data? So there is also an issue of community or community data rights, which we kind of begin to explore in this paper, and part of it is data is considered an extension of the community itself, especially within the African context. So yes, we have principles like transparency and accountability, but there are also other homegrown principles that articulate and speak to a spirit of collectiveness. And though, yes, it might be steeped in anthropology, we think that they can serve to help us to organize how we think about appropriating culture, appropriating data from the community. These are concepts such as Ubuntu, which means I am because we are, and Ujamaa, which is Swahili, sort of like for brotherhood. And it says like extensions of societies such as music, art, culture are jointly owned. And now this can also be applied to data. So we go back again to the notion of transparency and accountability. And we say that when M&E practitioners are going about their work, like how can they embody this throughout the cycle? But then we also look at how can we embody other aspects of like ensuring that we do not misappropriate data from especially community. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, being considerate of community data rights as well. Thank you so much for that, Mark. And Jerusha, I know you also working on a MELScan project with MELTech, and I'm just wondering, how does that work that you're doing? You'll tell us a little bit about that. How does that work also contribute to this debate as Mark was speaking? Sure,
thanks. So yes, we currently are working with MELTech, the organization, so that's Data Innovators, and MELTech, the organization, and partnering with MasterCard Foundation on a MELTech Africa scan, as well as there's some upcoming research on impact labs that will be start working on a bit later. And I think that this type of research, as well as other related research that other stakeholders and organizations are doing, is all part of kind of the supporting knowledge base related to responsible data governance. And these are kind of the other sources that are connected to the responsible data in M&E guidelines. And it's just kind of important to note that the guidelines is part of kind of a broader discourse that's happening at the moment. And just speaking specifically to the scan itself, as I mentioned, that we are doing this research, which is really a landscape analysis of various partners, initiatives, and solutions that are supporting tech-enabled M&E, as well as learning practices, with a specific focus on equity and inclusion, youth and community empowerment, indigenous knowledge and practice, and real-time decision-making. And with this research, we're also looking at what are some of the challenges and lessons that are related to the use of data and the use of multi tools. So we do have another session, which I'll mention shortly. We will share more detailed findings, but just to kind of point out a few things that are emerging from our initial analysis currently is that we are seeing, for example, that within this ecosystem of organizations that are either developers of Multic solutions or partners or have initiatives that are using Multic, is that many of them don't identify themselves as MUL. That these are often organizations that they might be developing a tech-specific solution or they work in the data space, but in fact, they also are making a contribution to MUL through research, through data, through learning. And why this is important from a responsible data governance perspective is that even within our thinking about who does responsible data governance, is that it is important to bring in these other entities and types of organizations in this kind of MUL conversation, because they influence how we also put in practice responsible data governance. And secondly, another finding that's emerging is that of the Multic solutions that we've been looking at in Africa, is that we're also seeing that there are very few cases that are the more kind of emerging or frontier tech. For example, few are actually using augmented reality or big data analytics. Many are using things such as drone technology or predictive analytics. But again, what does this mean for responsible data governance is that in our current kind of framework of thinking about what does responsible data governance mean for M&E, we must consider what the future of the field looks like. That in fact, what does responsible data governance of augmented reality mean, for example? So I think some of this kind of new insights will also shift and steer a bit of the thinking about what responsible data governance in M&E is. And we will share a bit more insight. So we have another session on Friday, that's the 3rd of June at 5 p.m. That's Central African time, where we'll have another global session where we're presenting some of the preliminary findings and also want to engage other global participants on their thoughts around this. But yeah, that's just kind of the initial inputs on what that scan looks like and how it's linked to responsible data in M&E.
I think, okay, you're back.
Did I drop?
Yeah, you were unstable for a second, I think, on my end anyway.
Okay, gosh. Which point was missed? Because
we were talking about the session on Friday. It's at 3 p.m. by the way. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, that was one of the second last points, is that we'll have that session where we'll present some more of the emerging findings that are coming out of the scan, and we want to engage participants around kind of their feedback, and perhaps there are gaps in some of the scan information that we want to engage and discuss. But the last point was just that this scan, in addition to other work that we may be doing in other organizations, is really part of, it links back to what responsible data governance in M&E guidelines and practices are really about.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jerusha. I'm going to move quickly to Des. Des, listening to all of this and what's coming up with the MEL scan in Africa, what do you think the future of responsible data looks like for governments? Maybe we can talk in relations to your case. You've given us an example of the DSD case. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. What do you think the future will look like for responsible data in government?
Okay. Thanks a lot for that question. I think some of the things that needs to be put in place that we don't have, it's policies and guidelines related to responsible data governance. and also working very closely with departments that is mandated to look at issues of data, like the Department of Planning and Monitoring, which sits in the presidency, as well as the Department of ICT. And after we've looked at the development with a number of key stakeholders in government, and also looking at all the different spheres of government, not only national government, but also provincial government and local government, it's then to look at the development of training against these policies and guidelines, and also then to develop sort of some training manuals, and also use different platforms that people could access to familiarize themselves and to improve on the data governance in the country.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tess. You know, we live in a continent, we know we have our own struggles with technology advancements and all of that. And I'm just wondering, what does responsible data mean, Mark, in a situation where digital divide remains a challenge in our African continent?
Thanks, Talita. To answer that question, like we kind of have to step back a little bit and look at what digital divide actually means. And like the literature shows us, like there are three definitions. There are three ways in which this manifests. First, it's an access divide. It refers to the possibilities that people have to access the resource, but they are limited. Why? Due to geography, sometimes due to gender, due to, and by geography, I mean like there are people who live in rural areas, and then also there are people who come from developed countries, and typically the global north versus the global south. And there is a material investment that needs to be done in infrastructure for you to be able to be connected and to digitize. Then there is the use divide, and the use divide has to do with lack of skills, and it impedes the handling of technology. So when's the first time a child will encounter a computer or a mobile phone? And again, manifests in different ways, but you know, it's typically the lack of digital skills and literacy. And the third one, which is kind of a little bit emerging now, is the quality of use. So you have the digital skills to find your way around the internet or mobile money, whichever the case may be, but you do not know how to make the most good of it. So you lack skills in quality use. So with those definitions, then back to your question, like what does it mean? So policymakers, and these are people in government, when they characterize the digital divide as just a lack of access, then there might be problems there, because when you just look at it as an access issue, you negate the need to build up the skills, and then also you negate the need to look at community-based initiatives that convince individuals or communities that you actually need to acquire these skills for you to move to the next phase, so to speak, where we are living, or the digital or the information age is here with us, and we cannot reverse that. But then there are some people who can also kind of have financial or cultural capital to avail themselves to get these skills. But overwhelmingly, we find that those who lack them, they tend to also have less money. So if you lack these skills, most likely you have less capital, you have less political clout, or you might be, disadvantaged by gender or disability, or by geography, or you live in a very rural area. So again, this is where policy comes in, or government comes in, because yes, the public-private partnerships can lay infrastructure or investments, but then there has to be policy that tells the government, like, I'm responsible for access. I'm responsible for moving the skill set of the populace. So we must look at all three when you're looking at the digital divide. And also we must attribute responsibilities to government, so that then by policy, we mean then government can allocate funding to build any of these three areas. So responsible data and looking at issues of digital divide must then appropriate the right responsibility, I think, in my view, mostly from government, in terms of creating these enablers so that, like, a data ecosystem can thrive. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for that rich answer. And I'm just thinking in terms of all of that and the exclusion, you know, does higher requirements for data protection create barriers for the localization process for smaller organizations, Jerusha?
So to put it simply, in some cases, yes. And I think, you know, what Mark has shared really frames, you know, what are some of the kind of the gaps, and what is the divide that influences how we can go about, you know, implementing data protection or other data governance practices, and that we must be conscious of the persons affected before we just kind of go forth and implement all practices and everything that we are guided to do. Is that we must interrogate what that means. And I'm going to just like speak to, if we had to, for example, think about the relief fund. So Desiree spoke to an example of such a relief fund, and I mean the depth of kind of planning and thought that must go into that. And there have been similar relief funds with various governments. And we've actually been working in a project where we've been exposed to kind of the individuals that are affected and what that means for them. And for most of these relief funds, there's a requirement that there must be some level of providing individual or private or personal information, both an individual or an organization. And this might be ID documents or records, which we know within South African context and others, often individuals don't have, or these have been lost or misplaced. And that's already a barrier that, you know, to provide my data is a challenge. And then when data is provided, it needs to be provided possibly through platforms or computers or smartphones where individuals don't necessarily have the skills or the capacity to access. And so these are really kind of two like barrier steps that the system is built in such a way to ensure security of information of that individual that's submitting the ID information, but the context in which they live restricts that they can actually even provide that submission. And in certain cases, what we've also seen is that in those contexts where I don't have the capacity or the skill or to actually submit my information, you often will seek support. And that's kind of the natural thing for that individual to do. But we then found that many individuals were then sharing personal information because it was the easiest way for them to do that, that I would WhatsApp a picture of my ID number in order for the process to move. And so I think that these are just kind of nuanced instances, and one example of where, you know, there are certain data kind of security and systems put in place which is also important, but then how do we make sure that when we put in place these data governance measures, we're also considering those individuals and what does responsible mean in different contexts? And I know Mark also spoke to the point around that data misappropriation, and it just sparked kind of my recall around, you know, data communication is very, to me, is something I'm quite passionate about. And I think that's another point within where there are spaces of possible exclusion, that at the point of kind of design and planning, we often plan with only the client or the initial user in mind, but not necessarily the person that is providing the data. And by not considering, actually, yes, we need to ensure that we're not disseminating all personal data at the point of communication within the cycle, but it is still important that that provider of data, that there's a feedback loop so that they also know how the data has been used or what it's useful to them. And I think often we miss that point because our focus is on ensuring that we're limiting where the data goes in the end, and miss the point of actually the data use is not only the a single user, but the provider of the data should also have some use of their own data as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Jerusha. A lot to consider there in terms of the data lifecycle and the involvement who you consider in the whole process, throughout the process of the data lifecycle. And Jerusha and Mark shared a lot around issues around capacity and skills. And I'm wondering if there are some of the capacity gaps in implementing data governance in government. What are those gaps? What are those capacity gaps? If you can maybe shed some light.
Thanks for that question, Talita. I think around the aspect of data governance, it's also very, I mean, the M&E training and the capacities to enhance people's skills and knowledge on monitoring and evaluation has been happening for quite some time now in government. Whereby you find that the M&E practices are institutionalized. You find that there are units or departments that focus and specialize in the M&E skills of the country, which is the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation. And then you find in every department, right up to local level, there is a unit or a directorate or a chief directorate dealing with monitoring and evaluation functions. So from that aspect, the knowledge and the skills has been sort of rolled out in the country, but there is a bit of a gap around the data governance aspects. And I think we also saw it when we were asked by the regulator, because we were just going to implement the evaluation study, but the regulator said, no, you cannot do it. You have to apply for permission to us. And that was the very first time. So there will be a need sort of to do a needs assessment across all three spheres of government, national, provincial, and local government, just to get an understanding of what are the gaps related to data governance. And then to work with institutions like the National School of Government to develop training material that can be then rolled out and see that these people within these M&E capacities have the necessary skills around data governance, and also colleagues who are implementing a number of programs and policies, because most programs is that also when you implement a program, a key area of verification is that you'd want to see that people are attending. You'd ask them for their name and their ID number. So I think we need to have sort of governance measures also delivered and shared with NGOs that's delivering a number and rolling out a number of interventions. I mean, on the part of government to see that they also have that training and that skills gap that is there. Thanks.
Thank you, Des. And Mark, to that point, what should be done to improve responsible data practices? Generally, what can be done? If we are to leave here and say, this is what should be done to improve responsible data practices, what would it be?
Yeah, so again, I go back to my first slide where we had an image of the national statistical system, and we started there knowing that there is both people from there are state actors and unstate actors, and there is need to appreciate that, but also appreciate the role of official statistics and the national statistical offices playing a key role that they lead and they navigate a lot of issues that come with supply and demand of data, especially when it comes to reporting on development. So we start from there. And what should we do? We should be able to give them equipment and skills and capacities to perform their task, as we have discussed here, but also like looking at the new data sources, like they are not always trying to catch up with new methods. So that is one. The second thing we should do is look at the responsibilities of civil society actors. And then also you've also heard about enactment of more than 25 data protection acts in the continent. So how do we support or assist civil society and Office of the Data Protection Commissioners in our countries to work on the topics of accountability and transparency when it comes to citizens' data rights. And then non-state actors who undertake vital statistical activities should be recognized within the NSS, within the National Statistical System, so that we can improve our data practices. There's more coming out of it. There's more value being derived out of statistical activities, which we just seen, they don't just belong to government actors. Then, when it comes to issues of support and funding, what is needed? I believe that like studies such as this, which we have done now, it's something that might be difficult for government to do, but you know, development actors and such can be able to fund studies and pilots which inform policy or research that is more nuanced, which can give government a place to start from as far as responsible data practices are concerned. Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for your contribution, and of course to the whole panel for your insights on responsible data practices and management in the field. That was really insightful. And I'm just gonna ask us to move into the Q&A. We have a question here, and if there are more questions coming from the floor, please do type them in the Q&A box. We are ready to answer those questions. So there's a question here: what kinds of steps do organizations take before sharing data to USAID's DED, or Development Experience Clearinghouse, or DDL, which is the Data Development Library, to protect personal information? I don't know if, Mark, you're comfortable taking that question.
Yeah, I'm also not like aware specifically on steps by USAID. Yeah. I could talk though about how we look at this topic from GIZ perspective, and I could talk about some of the projects that we have. And one of the things that we do is we have a digital rights check. So it's a process by which we do not just ask our partners, we do not just ask some of the intended data subjects, so to speak, from initiatives. We do not just ask them before, but post programming, we also come back to them and ask, like, was certain information collected from you? Did you give consent to it? Were you comfortable sharing it or not? And this also kind of helps us to program better. And I think part of that also tries to be deliberate around looking at gender and looking at exclusion when it comes to persons with disability. Such that if you have a program that maybe looks at capacity building, for example, that we are actually deliberate about not, for example, reaching out to an urban population, for example. Or if you have a capacity building program, the examples that you use and the trainers that you bring on board, they also like they are relatable as far as gender is concerned. So I could speak from that perspective of programming generally, and I could speak from that perspective when you're looking about the data that is collected through our programs. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. Are there any other contribution to that point from the panel? If not, I'll move to the next question. And the next question is it possible to have responsible M&E data governance if our M&E data collection tools are not culturally sensitive to our environment or community? So maybe I can post that to Jerusha.
Sure. So my thought is that I would say no, because a key word is that responsible element. It's that we're not necessarily just only looking at data governance for the sake of data governance, but specifically in the context of MIL, as well as that it is responsible. What that means, if we look as well in the responsible data governance for M&E guidelines, at the point specifically at planning as well as collecting, we need to ask about the risks of the data collection. And in the case of collecting data where the data collection tool is not culturally sensitive, there's a risk already imminent there, is that we may be collecting information that's not relevant. And this may have knock-on effects for how the data is ultimately used, if it's for an intervention or for funding. So I think that clearly interrogating why you're collecting the data, what are you collecting, and if we see that in fact it's not, because it's not culturally sensitive, we will not be collecting the appropriate information, is already a data governance risk. So I think that often we think about the responsible data governance just around like the storage and what we collect, but I think there are multiple other elements, including that. I think that's a really good question around actually we should also be questioning the cultural sensitivity around what we are collecting as part of data governance as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, Jerusha. And Linda, I see you have some thoughts as well, but more to the previous question. I'm gonna allow you to speak to that.
Okay, thanks. So I didn't introduce myself earlier, but I'm Linda and I've been working with the team also on this project. So I think the question around USAID, so there's a guide that USAID put out that I actually worked on, which is around considerations for responsible data management for USAID. So there's some guidance in there about this topic of protecting data before you submit. And this is relevant for any kind of open data submission that you might have. I know the UK, for example, requests open data from its grantees sometimes, and USAID does the same. So some important things to do is if you're collecting really sensitive data, you can request an exemption. Sometimes you have to discuss this with USAID, but you can request to exclude certain types of really highly sensitive data if you think that it would put people at harm if you shared it in the current form. You can also aggregate your data up to a certain level where individuals are no longer identifiable within your data. So provide more, higher level statistical data rather than raw personal data. And then another really important thing is if you're collecting data using software that tracks location, that will provide data on the exact geolocation of each individual in a survey. You'll probably want to try to remove that geolocation data from your surveys data, or also if you upload photos, sometimes the location data is embedded in photos, so you'll want to check on that as well. So those are just some thoughts around submitting open data or submitting data sets to USAID.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thank
Sorry
you
to
so
cut
much. No, that was great. Thank you, Linda. I don't know if we have any further questions. Please do keep them coming if you have questions for our panel, or if you have some thoughts as well to the USAID question. You're more than welcome to share your thoughts with us. So I will give it a minute to see if there are any more questions. There aren't any at the moment. Des, let me ask you a question while we wait to see if there are other questions that are coming in. And I just want to get your final thoughts on the work, on the guidance. And I'm personally more interested in the second report, because it gives you like your practical tip sheets on how to go about, during your data life cycle. And I just want to get your thoughts about what is coming out strongly for you. What do you think people will, learn from the guide itself?
For me, the guide is, firstly, it's well written. And I think especially for colleagues within, not only within the M&E space, but also colleagues who are working within the information communication technology area, in the ICT area, they would also find this extremely useful for them, you know, especially around the issues of data governance, because we've also started working very closely then having a very siloed approach in government, whereby the M&E colleagues would work on their own and not involve the colleagues from the ICT side. So I think for me, the collaboration, and it will also be useful not only for M&E people, but for other colleagues as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tess. I don't know, Jerusha, Mark, if you also have any thoughts, you are welcome to share.
No, I think Des has covered it well, so nothing to add to
Okay,
that.
perfect. Okay, great, no problem. So colleagues, that concludes it. Okay, there's a question from Karina. She says most of the people we interview in the field are in areas with no access to 3G or 4G. And so we have relied on ODK to collect data offline. A lot of government entities are especially interested in this kind of tool because they are free and easy to learn and use. The biggest issue, however, is servers. Are there servers that have been made available for easy access for low income and low cost maintenance? Mark, I think that question maybe relates more to your work.
Yeah, I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah.
So that's a technical consideration, and what you find is tools have the ability to kind of store the data on the device until you get to a stable connection where the data is uploaded and synchronized. And so that could answer that from a technical perspective. And it could answer you basically from the perspective of the technology, right? What is possible right now? And there's a lot of client-side processing of data that relies upon when you have a stable connection, then the pre-processed data can be uploaded. But the flip side of that, though, is issues of data sovereignty. So even if that data is uploaded into Kobo, where does the data sit? And if it's government which is running a program or a survey, and you collect data, will that data go to Ireland or it will go to San Francisco, or will that data sit in a data center, for example, in Nairobi or where the data subjects are? So those are issues that are being regulated by data protection offices around the continent, because there's need for that, for data sovereignty, for that data to be nearer to, or to be stored within the continent, so to speak. Because right now, the data is being extracted and the value is created outside the continent, and we are just consumers of technology. So even as we think about that issue from the question, the way you asked, I think also let's also think about it from us being able to leverage the infrastructure we have in Africa. Think about the Africa Continental Free Trade agreements that have been made and leverage them to use data to boost trade within the continent. Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I hope that answered your question, Karina. And there's a follow-up question as well from Sean. And he wants to know, is data encryption on mobile data devices important? For example, Kubo applications are not encrypted. Is that a concern? And okay, there's another comment from Sean also saying that last questions. Are governments prepared to set up data centers and manage the infrastructure and the security of these centers? So maybe Mark, if you can shed some light on the first question, Sean's question, and Des, I don't know if you have any inputs on the last question.
Yeah, so encryption is a concern because especially why do you encrypt is because there's some data that is it can identify people that's being collected, and that's why you want to encrypt. So it is a concern because often when data is it runs into the wrong hands, whether it's by the state or non-state actors, then it can be misused. So I could say it is a concern, and it is important, like when you're transmitting data, you encrypt it, like from device to the server, for example. But also, like we also have to appreciate the environment in which you operate. So if you use Android, it's Google based, it's an open source OS. Google is accessing that data. You will seldom find studies, especially in Africa, where we are using other hardware. So the thing is, at the OS level, we might not be able to put those safeguards, but maybe we can put safeguards at when you're transmitting the data. So that is one. And then number two, I will just comment a little bit about if governments are prepared to set up data centers. I think so of course Amazon and Microsoft have come to the continent, and they have data services and data centers, and there's a reason why it's very appealing to use these services, even for government. But we also look at the journey of government moving to automation, to automate or digitize services, to moving to e-government, like issuance of registers such as driver's licenses, IDs, passports, and so forth. So when those services are digitized, government must have a data center somewhere in the continent because of what I mentioned. So we find that, like, because of that journey of automation, like I could say for Kenya, for example, maybe it's 15 to 16 years into the line of automating various public services, and government being stringent about various agencies just pushing that data to a local government data center. And that data center, then it means government within itself has to ensure it has the talent for system administrators and for security and for networking experts who can manage that kind of cloud infrastructure for government. And what really happens is you train these people, and then they are taken away by private sector or by the big multinationals as well. So it's a continuous problem. We can't look at it simply from in a very simple way. But I know a lot of it is it's not getting the cow, it's not getting the servers, but it's like feeding and growing that infrastructure, getting the grass to feed the cows, so to speak, which needs a lot of vision and planning from a national ICT perspective. Yeah, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Des, any last thoughts to that? If not,
all right, thanks. Marcus covered me quite extensively. I mean, there's a great movement within government around the digital transformation. And I think I spoke about it where when COVID struck us, people then utilized their mobile phones to apply for social protection measures. And also, I read the other day in the newspapers that the Department of Home Affairs, they are looking at digitizing all their systems. And they were then employing a number of unemployed learners to do the digitization for them. Also, where we are seated within social development, we are looking at the implementation of real-time data. So we go into households, we collect data in real time. There is built-in mechanisms like referral systems, and then we track how services are done, if a family needs psychosocial support or they need other interventions of government. So the issue of digitization, it's becoming more entrenched. For example, we are also looking at electronic M&E systems within government. So we also therefore need to see then how do we enhance the policies around data governance. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Des.
Lisa,
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that point specifically around the government's preparedness, because we've done some work also with the South African Department of Planning and M&E, and I read your words, Sean, and it's specifically, are governments prepared to, like, it's current, but I think that in fact governments are becoming prepared, so they're not yet there. And I mean, to Des and Mark's points as well, because for example, through the work that we had done around really assessing what is needed to have a government-wide integrated system, it shows that there is intent, that it's around kind of at the point of still kind of testing and investigating what is needed. But I think that we are seeing that there's some progress. It's just we haven't arrived just yet. But that progress that we're seeing in like what's being questioned, considering having a national integrated data system and trying to figure out what's the infrastructure and the resources we need, is already positive signs that I think government is willing, and there will be movement, because yeah, I think it's the progress that is needed, and it's just it's kind of takes a bit of time to get to the point where we can say government is officially prepared. But I just wanted to add that point. Thanks, Tarita.
Thanks, Jerusha. Thanks for adding more inputs to that. And there was another question. Are we getting maximum value? And Jerusha, I'm asking you, from the amount of resources invested in conducting M&E activities when there are no appropriate responsible data sharing mechanisms, because that is contextual and data is in itself of no value until it is connected and shared.
Well, no, because ultimately it's around like the use and the learning, right? And if we're saying it's not a responsible data sharing, like if it's only being shared with a select group of individuals and there's no feedback to the providers of the data in some format, or it's not actually shared for its ultimate intended use, then that is not responsible data sharing mechanisms. As well as, I mean, like if we're not ensuring the security of the data that's being shared and how it's being shared, then I would say that no, we're not getting an appropriate return on our investment, because I think one is that from like who receives the data perspective, there's a gap in the use. But then two, if we're also sharing information in kind of in inappropriate ways, or sharing information that should not be disseminated, then it also kind of counters the purpose of M&E, and it creates distrust if that data is being shared in manners where personal information is accessible or identifiable information is accessible. So I think at those two levels, I would say no, and hence we have kind of these guidance and these ways that we can action on it. So I think that if we really put into place, again, I'm going back to the data life cycle, the responsible data governance throughout the path, including at the point of data sharing, then it is having it like a good return on investment, so to speak, on M&E is achievable.
Awesome. And last question, are there M&E frameworks to measure to what extent data shared for impact? Are there M&E frameworks to measure to what extent data is shared for impact? This is from Benjamin. I'm going to pose it to Mark.
Yeah, so the question is not clear. Maybe I could ask Benjamin to kind of expand on it.
Yeah, Benjamin, I thought maybe I'm also the one who's not reading it correctly. If you don't mind, you can just type in the question again.
Yeah. Data, is it the impact of the data or the impact of the M&E framework, for example? Yeah.
Or maybe it's about, are we measuring the impact of data sharing?
Yeah.
Okay.
To
So impact of data sharing, correct. That's the question. So are we measuring the impact of data sharing? Mark, are you still there? I don't know if maybe Mark has dropped.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I would go back to what Jerusha has said, and I have not heard of like these frameworks, but I know, you know, I've not looked at literature specifically examining this, but I know like there's work by like the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, who have looked at, you know, the issues to do with interoperability of data, right? Especially within government, for example, where there are silos. So maybe looking into interoperability is one aspect. Specific to M&E, though, I think besides what Jerusha had mentioned, I wanted to kind of highlight that it might be important not to look at these things that we are talking about as events, but rather like there's a continual progression. So I also look at it from the perspective that there is an emerging or a growing practice around M&E. That's one. Then number two, M&E in government specifically, because in absence of data, like what will people do? Decisions will still be made. I'm not saying that we don't make decisions, but decisions will still be made even if the data is not there. So in absence of a data sharing framework, right? Data will still be shared, but how does that look like? So I think my point would it as a continuum, as a progression of an evolving, an emerging good practice where we are not idealists, but we kind of like work together towards like moving towards like, you know, breaking down the silos, like conceptually in government, but also even in non-state actors. People don't share data there, right? They don't share. Like we will collect data for USAID, and it is for USAID, and we will not have access to it if we are from DFID, for example, unless we write some letters. So
Mark, I think we lost you again there. But I see Linda is also has typed in some more inputs around the data for SDGs. This is to Mark's point. So thank you, Mark, and Benjamin is happy with your response as well. So thank you so much for that. If there are no further questions, colleague, we can call it a day. We are available if you have questions for us. You can just send us an email. We will get to those. You can send me the email to talita.tlaka@wits.ac.za, and I will make sure that our panel and even those that are not on the call today gets to your questions. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We do hope to expand the work, like we said earlier in the conversation, not to just stop it here, but to develop. One of our conversations is to try to develop a module of the guide themselves into our flagship data. And we have shared the guides as well with our partner GEI to share with their country network so that they can adapt it to their country context. And we are open to whatever ideas that you also might have for us and how we can move forward with the work. So thank you so much for joining us, and do have a lovely day.